Welcome to Reflections on Identity, a podcast series exploring educators' narratives on their professional identity. Today is a special roundtable edition, and we would like to welcome Ollie Belas and Saul Keyworth, who are senior lecturers in education, but also have an interest in physical education and activity. Welcome, Ollie and Saul.
Thanks for having us.
You're very welcome. What we would like to start with is, could you tell us a little bit about your roles?
Yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in physical education, have been now for coming up 23 years. Uh, my main role initially was dance education within the secondary physical education course. So different people have different kind of physical backgrounds and they teach their specialism. Mine initially was dance and has remained so. But over time, it's been supplemented with a lot of stuff around equity and inclusion. So I do a lot of socio-cultural courses as well now, which also feeds into PSHE. So I also run the PSHE on the course. And as with all staff on the teacher education course, we also do a lot of school-based visits. So when our students are on placement. So a kind of multifarious role. I also teach dance to the primary education courses, the undergraduate and the postgraduate. And actually, last year was teaching physical education to the postgraduates more broadly. So doing gym, games, and all the other elements. Whereas up to that point, it had solely been dance, really. So that's
Thank
that's kind of my role.
thank you. Quite a range there. Ollie.
Right, so I'm senior lecturer at University of Bedfordshire, as you said, Carol. I'm course lead for the BA Honours Education, but I teach across English and education subject areas at the moment. I teach as much English as I do education studies. On the education side of things, I've got a particular focus on philosophy of education, which is one of the ways in which Neil and I know each other, and we co-teach um, uh, a couple of philosophy of education modules together. Um, my my background, my academic background is all in English. My PhD was in English, and before becoming a university lecturer, I was a secondary English teacher. Um, so far, you'll have noticed that I've said nothing about physical education, movement, the body, anything like that. But where my work in English and philosophy overlap, um, is that I have a long-standing interest in identity, identity politics, theories and philosophies of identity. And I think once you start talking about identity, as this podcast does in a number of very interesting ways, um, at some point you've got to at least think about, the body, the materiality of the body, and how that's implicated in any kind of notion of identity and conversations we might want to have about identity. So, although I don't have any kind of professional expertise in physical education, biomechanics, anything like that, I've got quite a long-standing interest in what you could broadly call the philosophy of identity, philosophy of the body, the cultural history of the body. And I'm also, as you all know, I'm a keen and pretty unlikely, um, keen but not especially good amateur, extremely lightweight strongman. I have to qualify that very carefully. So if anyone's grown up watching World's Strongest Man, um, I look the opposite of that. I'm 5'5", first thing in the morning, probably a couple of inches shorter after I've been to the gym and tried to lift all that ridiculous stuff. But I'm 5'5" and about 68 kilograms. So I don't look like the people that we used to watch at Christmas pulling planes and all that. But that's the kind of thing that I attempt um in my free time, and in various ways my thinking around education, my work as a teacher, but also my kind of approach to writing, and my philosophical thinking has been has been shaped quite profoundly um, by my by my uh, by my amateurish experiments in physical in heavy lifting.
I mean, thank you so much, both of you, for that introduction and sort of explanation of roles and background. Saul, why is sort of identity important to your sort of conception of yourself? Because it clearly is. Do you want to say a little bit about why is it important to you?
Yeah, it's important to me because I think for a long time I've kind of been located on the margins within the world of. Initially, I was a footballer, so I played sort of semi-professional football. I liked the game, but my identity, there was questions around my identity already there because I didn't partake in some of kind of the other baggage that went on in the kind of locations that I was in. So I was kind of marginal. So you start questioning yourself. Why is it? I suppose typically, but a lot of that stuff, you don't see it as a systemic issue. You see it as your issue.
Mhm.
So that was in football. And then kind of obviously when I entered physical education, teacher education, that kind of carried on that kind of marginal location because I kind of moved from football into dance. So you start having to ask yourself personal questions, why is it? My entry into physical education was going against the main narrative of PE teacher socialization, where a lot of PE teachers kind of had a positive experience, maybe of physical education at school, and then they want to kind of pass that on to others. My physical education experiences were quite negative in that the PE offering was really quite narrow. Football wasn't even on the curriculum, so as a footballer, that kind of didn't resonate. So I did kind of arrive at teacher education with an alienated entry and with a desire to do it differently. Although at that point, I didn't know what that differently meant or might look like, but I knew it could be different because, as I say, physical education didn't really speak to me at that point. And at that point, I'd just like to pick up something that Ollie said earlier, if I may. When you said you wasn't um, knowledgeable about physical education, Ollie, I would say that you are, because a lot of people's experiences or teachers' behaviours in PE do tend to be rooted in their biography when they themselves were at school. So having experienced physical education at school will have probably shaped you in ways that, have kind of gone on into your physical or your post-school physical activity sort of pursuits. So I suppose for me, that's kind of, and a lot of my identity stuff does relate back to limited and limiting notions of masculinity. And I think being on the margins of what they are, or maybe being perceived to be different or questioned to be different. I've had a lot of gender sort of and sexuality questioning over the years because of the activities. So getting into dance, for example,
Mhm.
raised certain people's questions. And then you start internally, like, well, why am I getting these questions? You know, so it leads you then into kind of beginning to unpack identity. And I think the reason I'm interested in that is I do see identity as socially produced. So we are part of the narrative scripts that are made available to us for consumption and that are invested with different forms of value or capital.
Okay, I mean,
And
we might
I've
well
been on
come
the
back.
margins.
Yeah, I mean, we might well come back to that in a minute, Saul, because you've said some very, very sort of pertinent and very important points around identity and where that comes from and what it's linked to. But if we can bring Ollie in for a moment, I mean, Ollie, do you want to sort of expand a bit about, who you are, what you do, what you study in relation to sort of identity and why you think, because again, identity is clearly important to you in yourself and as a field of study. So why is it important?
Why is what the kind of study of identity important? How
Why is your professional identity important to you, and
Yeah.
why are you conscious of it?
Okay. Oh crikey, that's a big question, isn't it? Um, I suppose So if I go back to so I said that before working in HE, I was a secondary English teacher. Um, a slightly more I won't go into the details, but a slightly more accurate timeline is that I did my PhD between 2004 and 2008. And during that time, fairly early on, I started working as a visiting lecturer at the university where I was studying for my PhD. Um, and I carried on teaching, so undergraduate, university level English, literary theory type courses, um, for 3 out of the 4 years of my PhD, and a little beyond that. And towards the end of my PhD, as that was winding down, and as the teaching looked like it might dry up or might not always be there, I started working as a classroom assistant in a secondary school. So they overlapped for a bit. The undergraduate, university level English and SEND support in a secondary school. And then from there, I stepped out of HE altogether, trained as a secondary teacher, and then 8 or so years later, sort of sidestepped back into HE. All that to say that kind of professional identity then is really bound up in my sense of being a teacher, being an educator, and how you navigate that. Um, and I know we're short on time, but for me, it was always this sort of how I how I constructed my sense of professional self, I suppose, was bound up in how I how I how I navigated my own kind of academic identity alongside my relationship with my students. That's a pretty crude, and that's not a very nuanced answer, but they were the two things that I was always trying to navigate, trying to balance, and wanting as far as possible to hoping that I had positive relationships with the young people I was working with. Um, there's a version of that which just makes you sound really, really thirsty that you hoped you were the teacher that people liked. But there's probably an element of that, right? Sort of, little bit of a little bit of a needy ego at work there. But beyond that, hoping that what you were fostering were positive relationships, and that is carried across into my work in HE, where I think the language we tend to use that we tend to see in the paperwork we deal with in university, we tend to see like lecturers, tutor, academic, and I genuinely still feel most comfortable just saying, I'm a teacher. That's the kind of identity that I inhabit. Um, and again, it's kind of, it's the kind of negotiations that I'm carrying out haven't changed. It's how do I do justice to they're no longer necessarily young people. A few of my students are my age, some are older than me, most are younger. Um, but how do I manage, how do I foster positive relationships with them? How do I do justice to them and their time at university and do justice to the subject areas and disciplines I'm supposed to be um, making available to them, right? I don't want to say teach them, but making available to them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but what I need to come to quickly, so Saul can come back in, is that part of that, and you and I have spoken about this to one another quite a lot, Neil, is how then do we wear that label of, like scholar, academic, uh, philosopher, like you and I have talked about where we fit in that. And Saul, to come back to what you were saying, Saul, kind of that sense of being in a space but somehow feeling like you're somewhere in the margins or somewhere in the interstitial spaces or something like that. um Maybe that's just, again, a needy ego at work. Maybe it's what people call imposter syndrome. Sometimes it is, I think, Neil, for us, it's our sense of where our disciplinarity sits, A, within philosophy, and then B, where our kind of marginal bit of a marginal strand of a marginal subject is also marginalized within education studies more broadly. So how do we kind of negotiate this like multiple marginality? And you and I sometimes say, well, maybe we just say we're writers, we're teachers and we're writers. And I'll pause in a moment, I promise. But that then starts to kind of, I suppose, you fold that sense of, all right, well, I'm a writer. How do you wear that label? How does that then feed into your sense of yourself as a teacher? How do you present the kind of the work, the labor of writing to your students in a way that doesn't make the academic essay seem like nothing more than a transaction or a joining of the dots? So all those things are kind of at play. And I'll pause there because I realize that I'm just starting to ramble now.
No, not at all. Not at all. All valuable stuff, Ollie. I wanted to bring Saul back in because Saul, you alluded earlier to some of the challenges around identity, particularly sort of socially, where we think of gender constructs or expectations. Do you want to say a little bit more about those sort of challenges that you've encountered, that not just you, but I suspect some or most of us have encountered at some point around,
Yeah.
particularly in relation to PE and physical education?
Yeah, well, one of the main things in picking up what Ollie said about doing justice to students and the subject is that I really try and get across the experience of the other, because I would say that my experience has been othered in many guises. So when you were talking about academic kind of identities, I actually failed school pretty much early on, and then stayed on and kind of failed it again, and then ended up at university not expecting to be there. In fact, I'll be honest, because I know we've got some English teachers in the chat. I actually hadn't actually read a book until I'd got to university. I think I'd read one, which might have been the personal story of a football player. But other than that, I'd never read a book. So, so I suppose I've been re-narrating my identity all the way along, because finding things that hadn't resonated earlier on. The struggles of that have been ongoing. Being somebody that wanted to read as a PE teacher sometimes gives you there is this kind of, and I'm not by any means saying all PE teachers fit into this by any stretch, but there is this kind of anti-intellectual stance within physical education, that you do stuff, but you don't necessarily think about what you're doing so much. I disagree with that comment, by the way, but there is this perception. So, yeah.
Can I just, that's a really interesting point. When you say that, do you mean that that's a kind of anti-intellectualism within sports science and physical education? Or do you mean or do you mean an anti-intellectualism is like mapped onto you by people outside of sport? They assume that because you're a PE teacher, you don't, do you know what I mean? Where's that coming
I
from?
I think it would be a little bit of both.
Right.
I think sports science might sit a little bit different. I think that's perceived different because it's got the kind of science. Whereas, yeah, PE, and again, I disagree with these, but it's just some of the perception.
Mm.
So I think I've said to you before, Neil, that when I trained, I won an award, the Angel of the Course, because, and this was given out by the students, not by staff, I have to say that, because I'd spent 4 years in the library. So that kind of, and dancing with the girlies, this is kind of what they said. So they're kind of saying what the expected route through is. And I was, maybe, and not the only one, lots of people read stuff, but, actually really engaging with the reading and going maybe beyond what you just need for a beat, the assignment, but actually just really getting into reading because it helps you transform and get different ideas and see things differently. But in terms of barriers, definitely around gender and sexuality, because there is this sense of embodiment. We talked about the materializing body, about, if I look at Judith Butler's work, where that is seen as being intelligible for the male body to be, and where it is seen as maybe less so. And I was definitely traversing some of those less so areas. So then you start getting critique, but also having to, take a deep reflexive look at my own identity work, because it took me quite a few years to realize. So initially I thought if I was dancing, I was beginning to challenge some of those scripts. Yeah, so some of those masculine scripts say boys shouldn't dance. And I would say in certain styles of dance, not all styles, the ones that are maybe not so overtly physical and athletic, the ones that may be a little bit more graceful, a little bit more lyrical. Um, and for many years, I thought I was re-narrating my kind of identity through just being in dance, but I was inadvertently reinforcing the script I thought I was challenging, because I was only dancing in strong physical. So I was still very much caught up, even though I was trying to challenge a narrative, I was still very much caught up within it. Uh, and it's only over a period of time that I've actually seen that and now been able to try and challenge that script. So moving beyond masculinity rather than just reinforcing it. And we see that a lot in school, where people are trying to challenge a certain thing, but maybe are inadvertently reinforcing the thing that they are trying to challenge. So to use an example of that, I know, because again, we've got in English, this notion that boys don't read. Well, some boys don't read, not all boys. And then there have been policies where they look at the kind of reading material that boys get and make it boy friendly. So it tends to reinforce rather than challenge. So I've been caught up in that narrative of where I've been trying to challenge, but for many years were reinforcing, not challenging. And I know we've talked about philosophy. This was stuff that I'd never looked at before, but the likes of Judith Butler, Pierre Bourdieu, and more recently Deleuze and Guattari have made me see that there are other ways, and that they're all just ways of being, and we shouldn't prioritize some ways and give them more credence and value over other ways. They're just different ways of being.
Ollie, do you want to come in on that? Because I know you've done a lot of work around sort of gender, identity, the body movement, how we kind of, in a sense, I suppose, project ourselves into the world. I mean, around identity, and perhaps link that to professional identity in some way or another. Have you got any thoughts you want to sort of add to Saul, or in addition to?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I'll try to. I mean, I think what Saul just said is like, A, it's fascinating, but B, I'd agree with him that, though, particularly the point, Saul, about this idea that very often, even in the act of trying to challenge certain kinds of stereotypes or break certain kinds of trends, we're still reinscribing certain kinds of norm, aren't we? So the boys don't read idea that Saul just mentioned. But then what you do is you reinforce a certain kind of gender script by doing. I'm repeating what Saul did here, but then by going, okay, well, let's find boy friendly reading material. So what's interesting is you're trying to break a trend within a certain kind of paradigm without ever challenging the paradigm or the frame itself. And I think the kinds of things that Saul's getting at, correct me if I'm wrong, Saul, but this is where I think he and I have got kind of, again, overlapping interests is, well, what happens if actually what happens if you're trying to mess around with the frame itself, right? Not trying to touch up or revise the picture within the frame, but actually trying to mess around with the border itself, with the terms in which these kind of discourses are framed. I mean, I could step away slightly from the academic space, but I think spaces are interesting here. I do think I just said I was going to step away from it, and now I'm stepping straight back into it. Something that I think about a lot are the ways in which we as teachers, tutors, academics, whatever set of labels we might choose, how we inhabit and move through the university space, and how that may or may not be, I suspect, very often is not the same way in which our students inhabit and move through the university space, right? So we may be in the classroom, say, occupying the same place. We may be together in the same place and time, but that classroom is not the same kind of space for me as it is for my students. And I think about that in various ways, but I do think about how I kind of articulate myself in in kind of intersectional terms, right? In kind of gendered, class-based, racialized terms. How do I articulate myself? Because I'm, in in a lot of ways, I'm about as, you know, the center ground, the center looks like me. Usually is a bit taller, but other than that, the center looks like me. And actually, I'm not representative of most of my students, right? So, and I'm not saying that's a point of tension, but how do you I'm always interested in how one articulates oneself with others. Mm. Um, and again, I know I haven't said anything specific about the body yet, but I don't think about that in kind of abstract terms. I try to be consistently non-Cartesian about this, right? So it's, I think about that as being, embodied persons in particular places at particular times, and how does that being together, how do we articulate ourselves? It's the it's that kind of Goffman idea of face, right? It's like there's no authentic you behind the mask. We are so many masks simultaneously. Now again, once again, I'm rambling. What I wanted to say was this point about space is I've I've thought about that more and more, and despite the vagaries of my comments, I've thought about that, I think, more sharply since joining this strength community at a particular gym at the Commando Temple in Deptford. I'll name it because I don't think gyms are always inviting spaces for all people. But what's interesting about this gym is it's if ever I've been able to step into something that really was a kind of Foucauldian heterotopia, right? Some people will be familiar with that idea. I think it's one of Foucault's like kind of least impressive ideas because it's so over theorized in a way that makes it sound you almost forget that these really are everyday spaces. They happen all the time, but this space in particular, you step into that space, and actually the sorts of things Saul was talking about. It's not that there's this overt attempt to rewrite or undercut kind of received gender scripts. It's that those kinds of scripts are just always in play in a way that's really fascinating because it's a really welcoming community. It's interesting that lots and lots of women choose to and lots of um gay, queer, non-binary identifying women and non-binary persons, um, queer identifying men as well choose to train in this space. And it's really interesting um, how you come together as a community, and all the kind of gender formulae, they're there, but they're also in flux in the act of trying to lift up a rock, or trying to lift a heavy bar. Well, I know that probably sounds like a stupid thing to say, but I find it really, really interesting how in these certain kinds of privileged spaces that are, on the one hand, everyday spaces, on the other hand, they're kind of quite special spaces. There's a kind of suspension of time, right? When you use a lunch hour to go to the gym, or you do an early morning in the gym, there's that kind of suspended time. But it's interesting how, as I say, all those kind of gender scripts are it's not that they vanish, it's that they're all in play. Coming back to Saul's point about Butler, right? You can see gender being done in those moments, and I find it fascinating.
Space is invested with value, isn't it?
Yeah.
Space very rarely, if ever, is neutral.
Yeah.
And it's always kind of realized through the bodies that inhabit it. So I'm wondering if the gym you're describing to some degree as well maybe has a certain group of bodies that go there because maybe they have felt out of place in other spaces. And this happens to be a much more open space where gender can be performatively signified.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I'm speaking for others now, so they would have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would say that's true of the coaches as well as of the punters like me. Um, the way the way that the professionals there have like genuinely kind of curated the body is also fascinating. They're not, if you go there because you want to be a bodybuilder, they're not going to turn you away, but they're not a bodybuilding gym. and none of the coaches is a bodybuilder. So one of the things they do simply by, like you're saying, Saul, simply by being there and inhabiting that space. And I think, it's important to remember that the coaches are educators, right? Bringing this back to education, they are teachers as well. Simply by being in that space and interacting with us and with one another in the ways that they do, they also they genuinely kind of reinscribe, what does a healthy body look like? What does a strong body look like? Because there are some coaches there who are like, the things they can do, it's genuinely wonderful. And I'm not just talking about kind of raw strength training here, but none of them has that post Arnie, uh, you know, um, flex cover image. Like, none of them's got a physique where they look like a condom stuffed with walnuts. They're not that's not kind of gym it is. So they're genuine, like they've and in many ways, and that's kind of, they're aware of this, that they really have kind of, they're aware of trying to reinscribe, as I've said, what, re-educate people as to what does a strong body look like, what does a healthy body look like. And I should mention, because I think this is important, it goes to some of what you were just saying, Saul. They're also the home of, as far as we know, the only queer and queer allied strength competition in the country. So it's also the home of this yearly competition called Queer Strong, um, which is pretty much what it sounds like. But again, behind that movement is this idea that we want to kind of open up the sorts of gendered performances that are accommodated in public or semi-public spaces, gyms in particular.
So, do you want to come in? I mean, Ollie's talked a lot about community there, which I think is really important. And one of the things I was planning to ask both of you anyway, do you get a sense of a community within the physical education environment or not? I mean, is your identity a collaborative one, or do you see yourself really as an individual working with other individuals?
No, I do see it as collaborative, within and without. So, for example, I think there's always been a strong uh, equity kind of presence within physical education. People have written about these things for many years. I think they've realised quite slowly, so change has been slow, but they've been writing around it. So there's a very strong academic community that I feel a part of, where, and that's kind of across the globe, different places. Uh, and yet, yeah, also within, probably less so within, more so without, I would say. I think sometimes when you work in equity, you do tend to be a lonely figure within a space. Sometimes, you are the equity one. I think that might be very different depending if you go to different areas, or maybe if you are, I should rephrase that. I think if you are constructing your identity around that, you might feel that way. Other people probably, it's part of their teaching, but maybe it's not wrapped up in their identity so much. So I think there's a difference there. Um, but no, I think it is collaborative. Um, yeah, I'd like to think so. Yeah.
Do you want to come in? I mean, you've already alluded to community, but are there other communities you feel you're part of within your professional identity?
Yeah, I mean, I've, I suppose, going back to comments I made earlier, you and I, Neil, have, spoken about the extent to which we feel we do or don't fit within, a kind of nebulous community of philosophers and philosophy. Within that, where do we or do we not fit within philosophy of education?
Mhm.
I think, you were one of the first people who I felt actually kind of welcomed me in, when I was very new to the discipline. Um, I've It's taken me probably, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this yourself, Neil, as a philosopher of education, but I suppose it's taken me a long time to get to a point where I feel I know there is a community out there, and there's a community that in many ways is very easy to reach,
Mm.
right? It's a relative, I mean, academic disciplines are often quite rarefied, right? So in principle, it's relatively easy to reach out to and make contact with others in our community, but who are the people with whom I have community? That's relatively small, and it's taken me a long time to cultivate. But that's also to do with a certain kind of it's a combination of potentially not very good character traits in me, really. It's probably to do with a certain kind of professional shyness, the imposter syndrome I also mentioned, also a slight resistance. I was reading some Frank Moten this morning, and there's a line in the Undercommons. It's not just him; he co-wrote it with Harney. They talk about academics who want to be. I'm going to get this the wrong way around. In the university, but not of it. And I hope I'm getting that the right way around. Um, but you can probably hear that even if I've got it the wrong way around, you can hear the distinction that's going on there, right? And I suppose that was always kind of partly how I felt, that I was always slightly resistant to, not wanting to become too much, a part of the machine, and
Mhm.
resistance 101. So, uh, but yeah, so there is a discipline. There's a disciplinary community out there, and it's quite accessible. But I think the people with whom I have community are those with whom I've developed kind of overlapping professional and personal relationships. Over time, it's been quite a slow go. I think I quite like that, though. I guess it feels a bit more solid,
Mhm.
to use another sort of spatial metaphor. That you and I wouldn't have met had we not had overlapping professional interests. But I think that kind of professional interest it's morphed into something that we'd call friendship.
Hmm.
And that seems to matter to me.
No, absolutely. I mean, Ollie and Saul, thank you so much for your time and lovely contributions. That's my sort of side finish with, but I just want to bring Carol in just to see if there's anything she wants to sort of add or take up from what we've said.
I don't think I have any more questions for you both. You'll be pleased to hear, but I think it's lovely to have such eloquent and honest accounts of identity, of formation of identity, and the associated challenges with it. And there's just so much more we'd have here to unpick, isn't there? But sadly, in the length of this podcast, probably don't have the time to do that. I think you've certainly given me lots of food for thought. So thank you both.
Thanks for having us. Good to see you,
Yeah,
Saul.
thanks for this.
You have been listening to Reflections on Identity. We hope you can join us for the next episode in our series, and we'd love to hear from you, so please put your thoughts in the comments. Bye for now.